Cuthbertson coming to the pod to record Off the Cuff. Today we're lucky enough to be joined by Right Honourable Sir Robert Buckland, KC. Sir Robert has been the MP for South Swindon since 2010. He's also had a distinguished career in law, having spent 20 years in criminal litigation, during which he was a member of the Attorney General's list of prosecuting counsel and won prizes for advocacy. Since entering Parliament, he's been Minister of State for Prisons Probation, Lord Chancellor, Solicitor General, Secretary of State for Justice and Secretary of State for Wales. He also chairs the All Party Parliamentary Group on Autism, and in February launched the Buckland Review of Autism Employment to ensure that autistic people are given the support they need to enter the workplace. Welcome, Sir Robert.
Thank you. Great to be on the show.
Thank you very much. So firstly, can you tell us a bit about your political journey and what led you to want to become a member of the House of Commons?
Well, I've been interested in politics ever since I was a teenager. A bit of a geek, an anorak, if you like. Fiona, you can describe me as that. Always interested in the world around me, about current affairs, what is good, what is bad. And I always felt I wanted to be a participant. I wanted to be involved. And although I qualified as a lawyer, read Law at Durham, and then qualified and went to the bar, politics was always a hobby. I was indeed a councillor in my 20s, a county councillor, but it wasn't until I was 41 that I was eventually elected to Parliament here in Swindon, which was a great thrill for me and a great honour. But I'm glad, really, that it happened then, because I was able to bring my life experiences of work in criminal justice and indeed my experience as a parent, an autistic child, to Parliament. And that's what I've continued to campaign on ever since.
I was going to say, how did your previous career as a lawyer prepare you for Parliament?
I think it was a really great training. It taught me not just about procedure and about how to do things. It brought me into contact with a range of people who perhaps I would never ordinarily meet. And it taught me a lot about the huge differences that people have in terms of opportunity, life choices. It just brought me that experience, I think, that really stood me in good stead, not just to advocate in the House of Commons, but also to represent constituents here in Swindon who come to me with a variety of issues and all sorts of challenges and problems, whether it's housing, tax, benefits, disability, you name it, people come to me. And I feel life has equipped me well to help not just understand their experiences, but to be a voice for those who can't speak up for themselves.
And of course, you are the Conservative member, but as you say, a lot of your constituents will also have voted for other parties. Working cross-party in politics is often key to getting change. So what would you say is the best example of this happening in practice?
My work in all party groups has really brought this out in spades, and I think it's a pleasure to work with Labour politicians and other party politicians on issues relating to autism and the need to drive up standards, increase awareness and change the culture, I think, when it comes to awareness and the way in which we approach neurodiversity generally. I think on specific legislation, I've worked to reform criminal justice, and I remember working on a cross-party campaign to introduce a law of stalking, which until 2012 didn't exist. Working with other politicians from all parties, we managed to do that in pretty short order. And that's just one example of how coming together with other politicians across the floor, you can get real change, even as a backbencher.
And as you say, you've worked cross-party regarding this subject of autism, and this brings us nicely onto the Buckland Review of Autism Employment that you published in February this year. The figures in black and white are quite shocking, with only 3 in 10 working-age autistic people are in employment, compared to 5 in 10 for all disabled people and 8 in 10 for none. Plus, autistic people face the largest pay gap in all disability groups. Now, your review sets out a number of recommendations to change these figures, and how are they going to work in practice?
It's an unusual review in that I'm not asking for another law or even a slug of government money for another initiative. What I'm suggesting in the 19 recommendations we've come up with is a real sea change in the way in which business, the economy, wider society approaches the way in which we interview and then support and retain autistic and indeed more widely neurodiverse people. Because I've no doubt that it isn't due to a lack of willingness from autistic people. It's because the system just doesn't work in an intelligent way. And I'm not just talking about people who have a diagnosis. I'm talking about all those hundreds of thousands more people out there who don't have a diagnosis, who struggle to either get a job because of the real ordeal that an interview poses, and then to hold that job down because of, frankly, a lack of understanding and support that means otherwise productive employees aren't able to stay in that workplace. And therefore, we've come up with some practical recommendations underpinned by a need for there to be a more standard approach, which we suggest that Autistic has produced the Neurodiversity Index that can be used by employers in order to standardise best practice, and then to work with organisations that are responsible for management and recruitment to embed different and more innovative ways in which we can interview and retain autistic people. It's going to take time, but there will be a task group as well of independent people who can help monitor the progress that I now think needs to be made in order to ensure that the recommendations in my report become reality.
You mentioned the Autistic and Neurodiversity Employers Index. It's about to launch and it's going to hold those organisations to account. So how important is it that companies engage with this?
I think it's vitally important. I think it's not just good for the potential employee, it'll be good for the company too. I think companies that do employ autistic people notice a significant increase in productivity, will find that there's a loyalty there and a longevity of service. In other words, it's a win-win situation for everybody. And once the scales fall from people's eyes, autism is transformed from being a risk to becoming an opportunity. And that's really what underpins the approach that I've taken.
And supported internships so far have only been open to autistic people with an EHCP. The Department of Education is piloting an entry route to supported internships for disabled people without EHCP. So what can employers do to make sure this pilot works and that there is a speedy rollout of that change across the country?
Employers can not just work with organisations like Autistica, but learn from each other. Where there are networks, for example, in the insurance industry, there's a very good network called GAIN, which really promotes the interests of neurodiverse people. The supported internships model is clear. It works where it's used. It really has positive outcomes and employers like it. So the more we can get this rolled out, the more we can see this being adopted universally, the more opportunities we will create.
How important was it to engage sector specialists in creating your report?
It was crucial. Very often we start reports on the premise that it is always the public sector and public servants who have the answers for the issues that face autistic people and neurodiverse people more generally. That's never going to be the answer. Whilst I think it's important that the public sector do embrace principles relating to neurodiversity, we are missing huge opportunities if the private sector don't lead the way. We're seeing good results in insurance, for example. They're doing well. Legal services, pretty well, but could do better, I think. I'd like to see financial services as well really take off with the engagement of neurodiverse employees. And not just employees, but neurodiverse people being able to set up their own businesses. Very often the autistic mind likes to work alone. And that means that very often they're best suited with support to being able to set up their own businesses, to be their own bosses, and to thrive in a marketplace that understands and recognises their talents. That's all I think autistic people are asking for, is that chance to shine, to access the same opportunities that neurotypical people perhaps sometimes take for granted.
And the review talks about the 2018 Neurodiversity at Work guidance by the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development. So how can this guidance be leveraged into best practice for employers?
I think that review is a very good starting point. I think its recommendations can be and should be embedded as best practice. I think working with the Institute and its members, we can help spread that even further. And I think that'll be one of the roles of the task group in order to make sure that we are engaging not just with individual companies, but with representative bodies to ensure that we can cover as many bases as possible. I think also of recruitment agencies and the role that they have in supporting SMEs to recruit and retain employees and really help with a sensible model for interviews, CV preparation, a more savvy way of really engaging with a cohort of people who at the moment are not being engaged with. So all in all, the economic arguments for this, I think, are as strong as the moral arguments that we so often hear.
And what do you think is the common myth about young people with special educational needs that needs to be dispelled?
Employing somebody with needs is a problem. It's a risk, it's a challenge. They're not going to be as reliable as other types of employee, that they will be a cost, they will be a burden. The experience of many employees is precisely the opposite. And when you think about it, this was the position we were in perhaps a generation or so ago with mental health, where people didn't want to talk about it, they thought it was a problem that couldn't be acknowledged. It was a sign of weakness. Look at the way we talk about it now. The openness, the removal of stigma, the acknowledgement that sometimes our mental health isn't going to be great and that we need time to decompress and understand. Now, why can't we apply the same principles to neurodiverse employees who, with time and space and support, will, in so many respects, be productive, loyal, and a real benefit to any company or business that might employ them?
And going back to education for autistic children, Duncan Baker has produced his 10-minute rule bill that you support that will make it mandatory for teachers to be trained in identifying autism before they even go into the classroom. So how important is this bill in providing the framework for young people to get the skills they need to prepare them for life?
Well, Duncan's bill is a really welcome intervention, and I'm really happy to support his work. It reminds me of the work I did 10 years ago to push the National Institute of Clinical Excellence to produce national guidelines about the provision of clinical services for children and adults who have autism. And that happened as a result of a campaign that I helped lead. We've come a long way since then, but we are still in a position where, in order for many people to access services and to get the level of support they need, they have to have a diagnosis, and there are delays. Time is being lost, and so is education. And I think that nothing short of a wider cultural change in the way that we equip teachers, teaching assistants, and the educational establishment is needed in order to deal with the here and now. And that's why I think Duncan's approach is the right one.
And what other issues facing young people not get the coverage it should?
Events like World Autism Acceptance Day, Autism Awareness Week, all these things are important in trying to get these issues to the forefront. And it's been refreshing for me this week to be able to appear on national BBC television to talk about autism. I can tell you the times that happens are vanishingly rare. When it does happen, I seize that opportunity with both hands because I know that, unlike the priorities of perhaps some who manage the news, the interests of families and communities and parents are very often centred upon loved ones who are autistic or who are neurodiverse. It's all around us. It's part of who we are. And I think we've got to talk about it far more than we do at the moment.
And coming to general issues, what issues are you finding on the doorsteps of Swindon?
Well, Swindon is a town that always offers me its opinion on a range of issues, and that's why I'm proud to represent it, keeping my feet very firmly on the ground here and out and about as I am the recess, and in fact every week campaigning here. I'm picking up issues that relate to everyday life, cost of living, the need for infrastructure and transport solutions, the need to make sure our health service is responsive, and making sure that we live in safe and healthy communities, which is why I do a lot of work on policing and law and order as well. Swindon is a place that always gives me plenty of work. I'll be having another big surgery this week, talking to residents about their problems, and I'm proud of the feedback that I get, which is positive, which is the reflection of the thousands of different cases I've handled for residents over the years, and the work that I get stuck into here on behalf of residents, businesses, charities and community organisations year in, year out.
And do you think the election's going to be influenced by social media?
Oh, I think social media is becoming more and more important. And I've no doubt that it will play a big part in the election, which is why I engage regularly with it, particularly where I know residents use media like Facebook, for example. But I'm also aware of potential threats from deepfake that can, at the press of a button, spread misinformation very quickly in a damaging way. And that's why I'm campaigning with others to make sure that here in the UK we're not only prepared for it, but that we are preventing the spread and use of deepfake and misinformation, which will, I'm afraid, only serve to turn people off politics and damage that very important links that politicians must have with those that they represent if they are to do the job effectively. I pride myself on the closest of my links with my fellow residents in Swindon that I represent, and I'd hate to think that would be undermined or removed or damaged in any way.
And do you feel positive about the future?
I've always been somebody who's positive about the future. I've had, like many people, my fair share of ups and downs, but I've always learned that it's not whether you fall, it's how you bounce and how you come back from a setback that really marks you out. And I'm still as excited about the future as I was when I first took up my first case at the bar 30 or so years ago, and when I first entered the Houses of Parliament 14 years ago. I'm lucky to have that sense of optimism, of curiosity, and of enthusiasm for what will come next. Politics is about tomorrow, and that's what I keep focused upon.
And going slightly forward, as you say, will the world look like in 5 years' time, do you think?
Gosh, well, I certainly think artificial intelligence and machine learning will be playing an increasing part in our affairs. I think that far from removing work, I think we will be finding new and different types of work and ways of working. I think that whilst the world will still be an uncertain and probably an unstable place, I think we'll be finding ways not only to improve our security when it comes to food and energy and defence, but that we are continuing to ensure that we win the war on climate change. And therefore I think the world in 5 years' time will be familiar, but yet full of the differences. Were we standing here in 2010, we'd be looking at the world now and being quite astounded about some of the changes that have taken place. So let's be prepared for the unexpected, but let's make sure that we are preparing in a way that genuinely offers security and safety for our citizens.
And what gives you the most hope for the next generation?
Well, I think the next generation themselves give me hope. I talk a lot to my children's generation. They are well informed, they're well balanced, they're kind, they're open about issues like mental health in a way that we weren't. They are accepting of difference in a way that we weren't encouraged to be so. And that can only be good things for issues like neurodiversity, I think. And I have great confidence that the next generation will take on the baton and pass it on to their children in a way that we can all be proud of.
And finally, where can people go to learn more about you?
Well, have a look at www.robertbuckland.co.uk or look me up on Facebook. I've got a Robert Buckland page and a Robert Buckland KCMP page as well. And I'm on Twitter at Robert Buckland. I'm fairly easy to find on Google. So please have a look and get in touch if you're a constituent or if you have autism-related issues that you want to raise with me. I'd love to hear.
And with that, we come to the end of another fascinating interview. So, Robert, thank you so much for coming to talk to us today. It has been most interesting to hear about your work supporting the most vulnerable in our society and helping them make the most of themselves. And thank you to the listeners who've enjoyed the show, hopefully, as much as we've enjoyed making it. As always, if you have any questions regarding the podcast, please feel free to comment. If you think it's worth coming back, please like and subscribe. If you feel you need something to tide you over to the next podcast, please buy my book Party Games on Amazon. And on that note, I'll see you next time. Hope you have a good week, one and all.